Now, as a procurement specialist, you're going to be playing three roles when you're dealing with external suppliers. Now, the assumption here is you understand, I'm assuming that you understand that there is internal suppliers and then there are external suppliers, and you in fact do know the difference, okay? Anyway, so three roles, okay? Which are these three roles? Selecting, having contract with, and managing an external suppliers. How does procurement cycle come in here? Well, it does so in two ways, okay? Two main ways. And these are pre-contract award activities or stages. And number two, the post-contract award activities or stages. I mean, once you look at all the 13 steps or 13 stages in the procurement process or the procurement cycle, well, do you notice that you can just separate those things into two and simplify your understanding of the procurement cycle? And before you look at all those things, don't forget to hit the subscribe button, okay? Subscribe if you haven't subscribed, if you like this sort of content, because we are aiming for 100,000 subscribers. Basically, help us grow the channel. It won't cost you a thing. So hit the subscribe button. Come on. So let's move on. The procurement process refers to the steps that procurement team must take to acquire the right product and service for the organization. Now, the process will definitely vary depending on the organization you're dealing with. But for the most part, a comprehensive look of the procurement process will give you the following 13 steps or stages. So in this case, defining business needs and developing specification, conducting market analysis, and the make or buy decisions, developing the strategy and plan, pre-procurement market test and engagement, developing documentation. So in this case, we're talking about things like pre-qualification questionnaires and detailed specifications, supplier selection to participate in tender, issuing the tender documents, bid and tender evaluation and validation, then you award the contract and implementation, warehouse logistics and receipts, contract performance and improvement, supplier relationship management, as well as assessment management. If you look at that, okay, like it's a long list. But the truth, as we said when you're starting, it's just two things. All those things can just be broken down, or they can just be summed up into two main parts. That is figuring out what you want and how it will be supplied, after which you just manage the asset. In short, we're talking about pre-contract activities and post-contract activities. Basically, two steps. So let's talk about those ones. Number one, the pre-contract award activities. So these are the first 8 stages, okay? The first 8 steps in the comprehensive procurement sort of cycle, okay? The one that is given by CIPS, the 13 steps, the one that we just talked about. So what do you want and how do you want it delivered? That's the thing. So number one, defining business needs and developing specification. In this case, you're just figuring out exactly what is it that you want, because that is pretty much what business needs are, okay? If we want printers, if you want a car, if you want a truck, basically that's the need. But what sort of truck, what sort of car, what sort of printer do we want? That is specification. Now remember, specification can be performance-based or conformance-based. If you want a website, okay, you can just tell the designer, here's what you want, okay? A website, we want it to do 1, 2, 3. And is the theme, colors and things of that nature. Go crazy, come up with something, be, creative. See, that is performance-based specification, okay, or functional. But then if you want part of a machine, so maybe a machine breaks down, there's a specific part that you need, then you are not telling them to be creative. You're telling them, here is what I want you to conform with. This width, this dimension, this weight. So it becomes conformance specification. All that simply falls under identifying the business needs and developing specifications, okay? At this step, you're just figuring out what is needed so that you can later communicate that to the suppliers, okay? Be it internal or external suppliers. Now, number two, market analysis and the make or buy decision. So you have to understand that just because you know what you want, be it in terms of business needs or specification, doesn't mean that the market has that thing, or doesn't even mean that the market will give you that thing exactly at the price that you want it. At this stage, you conduct the market opportunity analysis research to assess the market options available in the market. And so basically, you are assuming that you're dealing with external suppliers. So if it is external suppliers, well, what exactly is in that? In fact, even if you're dealing with internal suppliers, who are the internal suppliers? So let's say you want a website, right? You can have somebody from outside to design it for you, or you can tell your IT team. Now, If it is something that like the make or buy decision and decide to make it because you're using internal suppliers, then maybe there are parts that they need to buy, which means you still go to the outside market. So you'll still conduct that analysis. That is what you're doing here. All is just part of the things that you do before you add a contract. You figure out what you need, conduct the market analysis, decide, do we make this thing internally or do we get it from outside? Basically, buy. Number 3, develop the strategy and plan. So you're not just going to run into the market. Okay, you need to figure out how exactly do we get these things from the market. Are we going to be negotiating directly with the suppliers, like one-on-one? Do we do competitive bidding? If that is the case, how do you go about it? Okay, so you still need to develop a strategy plan which should consider the values and the ESG goals of the organization, as well as the potential impact of the external environment. So that's what you're doing here. Remember, you haven't even gone to the market, right? You've just figured out what you need. You've just figured out whether or not market has it, or whether or not you should even make it or buy. And now you're just figuring out, okay, what strategy do we use if we decide to go to the market? So all this is just part of, again, pre-contract award. Okay, Number 4, pre-procurement, market test, and engagement. This stage includes identifying the current and the future needs of both stakeholders and the business, as well as how changes in procurement strategy can affect any of those needs. What you're actually just doing here is, you're like, okay, we're about to go to the market. But before we go there, last check, okay? Is this what was required as far as the business need is concerned? Is this what the stakeholders wanted? Is this what you actually want? You're basically just doing your final checks and then you go to the market. And so, yeah, because you might rush to buy something and then you realize it would have just been cheaper to make this thing. Why? Because you failed to talk to some the guy in charge of research and development or something like that. Now, anyway, number 5, developing the documentation needed. So, again, look, as I said, these steps are not always going to be this long, because if you're talking about documentation, the assumption here is we are going to be using some form of competitive bidding. Or the documentation could just mean a detailed request for, proposal or something like that. So whatever documentation that you're going to use based on that step where you talked about the strategy and plan. So you're developing those ones, because when you're coming up with your plan, you decided, okay, we're going to use a tender. So if you're going to use a tender, then you need the documents. Or if it was just figure out, okay, one supplier. So let's just send RFQ, request for quotation, evaluate the quotation, pick a supplier, and we are done. Okay. So, that's the thing here. The documentation will depend on the strategy you had in place. So again, look, this is just one long line. It's just, we are doing this thing before we add a contract. So before we add contract, we know the problem, we figured out the market, we figured out the plan. And so, we are continuing, right? So number 6, supplier selection to participate in tender. Why? Because we've decided to go with tenders, which means we've done our we've sent things like the questionnaires so that we can qualify the suppliers, and then we've decided these are the suppliers you're working with, and then so we're sending out expression of interest, okay, expression of interest or invitation to tender, whichever one that you're using, to those suppliers. So the suppliers do their thing, return the bids. What do we do next? Simple. We issue tender documents, and then we evaluate the bid. So bid and tender evaluation and validation. So look, that's the first part. Okay. So if you're struggling with the procurement cycle, it's just that. Part 1. What is part 1? Pre-contract award stages. Okay. Or the pre-contract award part, which means everything you're doing from need identification to evaluating the bids so that we select the supplier. So what are these? These are just defining business needs, market analysis, okay, basically the make or buy decision, developing the strategy and plan, how do we go to the market, that is pre-procurement, market test and engagement, developing documentation needed, supplier selection to participate in tender, issuing of tender documents, bid and tender evaluation. Now, that's the first part. So let's move to the second part. What is the second part? We need to award the contract. So in this case, contract award and implementation. warehouse logistics and receipt. Now look, the warehouse operations need to be considered to ensure a smooth, efficient process. So this can include product coding and classification, space layout and racking, frequency of deliveries, waste management and recycling. Okay, consider environmental implication and ensure sustainability standards are adhered to both internally and externally. Look, speaking of warehouse logistics and all that, I'm currently working on series of, basically an online course, series of training, okay, video training on logistic management, basically how you can start your own logistic management business and what you need to know about logistic management. So if you're interested, make sure you join our newsletter, okay, linked it below. And yeah, once that one is up, you'll be notified. In the meantime, in that newsletter, you're going to be receiving weekly videos, weekly tips, weekly summaries, weekly, you're going to receive content, weekly download, things of that nature. You're going to be receiving them weekly. So make sure you're part of the newsletter. So two things. One, if you haven't subscribed, subscribe. If you aren't part of our newsletter, join. You're going to access resources. Anyway, let's move on. So number 11, contract performance and improvement. So we already awarded a contract. And in this case, okay, what are we doing? We're just asking ourselves, are they doing what they're supposed to be doing? How do we know that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing? By looking at the key performance indicators, the KPI. Those are the things that you're going to be using to manage the person you just gave that contract to. Okay. Next, we have supplier relationship management and then asset management. So the stages, as far as the cycle is concerned, as many as they look like, because you're just doing a comprehensive thing, because we have no idea what sort of business you're dealing with. Now, all those stages can be divided into two. Okay, the things you do before you award a contract and the things you do after you've awarded the contract. Just look at it that way. So if you're stuck, just ask yourself, okay, it's a business, they need some things. So between need identification and supplier selection, what is happening in between here? And then after you've selected a supplier, it means you're adding a contract. What is happening after that? Okay, so it's just those two stages. That's an easier way of understanding, okay, the procurement cycle. So if there is any question, do let me know. See you in the next video.